My name is Amy Kunkel, and I'm a secretary to Paula Ridge Elementary School. As a school, we are all reading the same book together, and this year we are reading Pie by Sarah Weeks. I am reading chapter 4. It begins on page 39. So here we go. Her cat, Alice's mother shrieked after Alice returned home from Mr. Ogden's office with Lardo's carrying case balanced precariously on her handlebars. Is this some kind of a joke? What about the recipe? How Alice dreaded being the one to have to deliver the news. She left it to Lardo, Mom. What do you mean she left it to Lardo? How do you leave a recipe to a cat? I don't know, Alice answered honestly. Aunt Polly told me she kept the recipe in her head. Surely Mr. Ogden explained it to you. Alice told her mother what Mr. Ogden had said about how his job was only to inform her of what Polly had decided to do with the recipe, not to explain why. That's ridiculous, huffed Alice's mother. I'm going to call Mr. Ogden right now and get to the bottom of this nonsense. Meanwhile, Alice's father was dealing with a completely different issue. Achoo! He sneezed the minute he laid eyes on Lardo. Highly allergic even to the word cat could set him off. Even the word cat could set him off. Achoo! 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 Mrs. Anderson reappeared a few minutes later, looking ashen. The phone call with Mr. Ogden did not go well. Although he had confirmed that the pie crust recipe had indeed been passed on to Lardo, Polly Portman had provided absolutely no instructions in her will as to how this was to be accomplished. I should have known it was too good to be true, Alice's mother said, putting her head in her hands. That recipe is worth millions, but Polly decided she'd rather throw it away than give it to us. Not only that, but without the pie shop, what good would the souvenir stand be now? There, Ruthie, don't cry, said Mr. Anderson, comforting his wife. I'm sure there's an explanation. Perhaps Mr. Ogden misplaced a page of the will. Alice shook her head. There was only one page, she told her father. Still, there must be some reason she's done what she's done, he insisted. Then he pinched his nose to stifle an oncoming sneeze. She hated me, George, Alice's mother wailed. That's the reason. Aunt Polly didn't hate you, Mom, Alice said. She didn't hate anyone. How can you defend her after what she's done? Her mother shouted through her tears. Clearly, your precious aunt didn't care about any of us, not even you, Alice. Her mother's words stung, even though in her heart, Alice knew they couldn't be true. Aunt Polly had loved her. She was certain of that. Still, she couldn't help wondering what her aunt could have been thinking, leaving something so valuable to a cat. What are we going to do, George? Alice's mother cried. What are we going to do? Take the cat up to your room, Alice, her father said quietly, and find him something to do his business in. Your mother and I need to talk. Aunt Polly had kept a covered cat box for Lardo in her bathroom on the floor under the sink. It was filled with sand and had a little hinged door in it so he could have privacy while he was inside. The best Alice could come up with was a cardboard shoebox, which she filled with ripped up newspaper and placed it in the corner of the room. She went downstairs to the kitchen and came back up with 2 little bowls, one for water, the other for tuna fish, which was the closest thing to sardines that she could find. Lardo was still in the carrying case, watching her every move with his scary yellow eyes. Alice was afraid to get too close, so when she finally got the nerve to let him out, she used a bent coat hanger to pull the zipper. The second the flap fell open, Lardo streaked out of the case and scooted under the bed, hissing all the way. He stayed there for the rest of the day. When 6 o'clock rolled around, Alice's stomach was rumbling like an empty garbage can rolling down a hill. But downstairs, there was no sign of dinner. Her father was parked at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper. News travels fast in a small town like Ipswich, and the headline read, "Pie Queen leaves secret recipe to cat." "Where's Mom?" she asked. "Gone to bed with a sick headache," he answered, reaching for a napkin to wipe his mouth. In front of him on the table was a half-eaten piece of pie. "Where did that come from?" Alice asked. "I found it in the back of the fridge," he said. "There's one piece left if you want it." Alice crossed the room to the refrigerator and pulled open the door. On the bottom shelf, between a jar of dill pickles and a head of iceberg lettuce, sat a tin pie plate containing a single slice of lemon chiffon pie. It seemed like only yesterday that Alice had pricked the bottom of that pie shell 5 times with a fork and sat on the tall red stool while Aunt Polly crushed ginger snaps and peeled thin yellow curls of lemon skin to decorate the top with. "It's a little past its prime," commented Alice's father from behind the newspaper, "but still delicious." Alice got a fork from the drawer and carried the pie tin upstairs, where Lardo was still hiding under the bed, and the bowl of tuna fish untouched. Aunt Polly and Alice had been alike in many ways, but when it came to eating pie, they were opposites. Like most people, Aunt Polly would start at the front of the slice and work her way to the back, but Alice always began by breaking off the crisp edges of crust, then moving forward, saving the tip, her favorite part, for last. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, Alice began to eat the pie. Having spent nearly a week in the fridge, the crust was not as crisp as it had once been, but when the first bite of lemony mousse hit her tongue, Alice closed her eyes and smiled. "Why is it called chiffon?" she remembered having asked her aunt. "Chiffon is a kind of fabric," Polly had explained, "cool and silky and lighter than air. Like those little puffs when your breath makes when it's cold outside." "Yes, sweet girl," said Aunt Polly, leaning over to kiss the top of Alice's head. "Exactly like that." Each bite brought back more happy memories, until all too soon, Alice had reached the end of the pie. The tip had always been her favorite part, but this time when she pierced the pale yellow triangle and brought it to her lips, a single tear rolled down her cheek. It would be the last time she would ever taste one of Aunt Polly's pies. Later, she put on her pajamas and brushed her teeth, and then crawled under the covers and read for a while until her eyelids began to droop. It was 8:30 when she turned out the light, and after a minute, she heard Lardo come out from under the bed and walk across the room. There was a full moon that night, so enough light was coming through the window that Alice could see him gulping down the tuna in great, greedy bites. He must have been starving after 3 days alone in the apartment, probably scared too. For the first time, it occurred to Alice that she and Lardo might have something in common. "You miss her too," Alice whispered. She had always been afraid of Lardo, but maybe with time she could learn to love him. After all, Aunt Polly had loved him. As she watched Lardo lick the last of the tuna fish from his whiskers, Alice felt another song coming on. 3 sardines on a little blue plate, all neat in a little line. Now that Aunt Polly has left us, did you know that you're legally mine?" She sang it softly a couple of times and tried to come up with a less technical sounding word than legally. But it had been a kind of a long day, and she ended up falling asleep. In the middle of the night, Alice was awakened by a noise. She turned on the light and wondered if maybe Lardo had knocked something over, prowling around in the dark. He was nowhere in sight, and nothing in the room seemed out of place, so Alice decided she must have been dreaming. Feeling a little chill, she shivered, then dove under the covers and went back to sleep. Alice was not the only one awake in the middle of the night that night. Mayor Needleman was suffering from a bout of indigestion and had gotten up to make himself a bromo seltzer. He had stood at the kitchen sink in his bathrobe, sipping sipping the bubbling concoction, he happened to look out the window and see a big green Chevrolet roll by with the headlights turned off. Who on earth could that be at this hour? He wondered. And then he burped loudly and went back to bed. The next morning when Alice woke up, she discovered that Lalo had left an unpleasant little surprise next to the shoebox. She cleaned up the mess, and after carefully checking to make sure that the door was latched tight, went downstairs to get some breakfast for herself and see if she could rustle up another can of tuna fish for Lalo. Achoo! Her father greeted her from behind his morning newspaper. Bless you, said Alice. Alice's mother was standing near the sink, hunched over a big bowl, stirring something vigorously with a wooden spoon. As she stirred, white clouds of flour rose from the bowl and fell like a dusting of powdery snow on the floor at her feet. There was a carton of cream and a tin of cocoa powder sitting on the counter nearby. Alice was pleased to see that her mother had recovered from her headache and was feeling up to doing a little cooking. She took this as a good sign. What are you making, Mom? She asked. Her father, his nose buried deep in the morning newspaper, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Your mother's making a pie, he said. A pie? Alice exclaimed, unable to hide her shock. Alice's mother turned, her scowling face smudged with flour. There were dark circles under her eyes. Clearly, she hadn't slept. That's right, she said, a pie. For the first time in 13 years, somebody other than Polly is going to win the blueberry, and I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be me. Alice could think of a very good reason. As far as she knew, her mother had never made a pie in her life. Thanks to your aunt's generosity, her mother continued, your father's out of a job. Reverend Flowers has the pie shop, and what do we have? Achoo! Alice's father sneezed right on cue. Precisely, said Mrs. Anderson bitterly. So yes, I'm making a pie. And unlike my sister, when I win my blueberry, I'll have the good sense to sell my recipe, not leave it to Cat. She turned back to her bowl and resumed stirring. You don't need to do this, Ruthie, Alice's father said. I'll put a call in to Hoover tomorrow. If they can't take me back, I'm sure I can find something else. You're not the only one who's going to be looking for work, George. Without pie, everybody in town is going to be scrambling, said Alice's mother. It was true. A lot of folks in Ipswich were already worried. Dick Capperfew, the owner of the Ipsy Inn, had gotten so many calls from people canceling their reservations. He only had one guest room occupied at the moment. Business downtown had slowed to a snail's pace. The diner was so quiet you could hear a fork drop. And Melanie Needleman couldn't stop complaining about the impact Polly's death was going to have on her husband's campaign. If only she could have hung on until after the election, she'd said to the mayor just that morning over coffee. He'd nodded, pretending to listen, but his mind was elsewhere. Pumpkin, he said with a sigh. His wife smiled, thinking it was a new term of endearment, but when she questioned him about it, the mayor had confessed it was actually Polly Portman's pumpkin pie he'd been mooning over. I've had such awful cravings for it since she passed. It's driving me to distraction. Mayor Needleman was not the only one in town who had been suffering from pie withdrawal. Dolores Evans, a cashier at the A&P, had been rushed to the emergency room that day with heart palpitations. The doctor had sent her home with instructions to take 2 aspirin and try not to think about banana cream pie. You remember the way Polly always made it, the mayor had gone on, with that wonderful crumbly stuff on top? It's called streusel, Henry. It's extremely fattening. And delicious, he said wistfully. Melanie Needleman had frowned at her husband. How can you think about pie at a time like this? The future of Ipswich is hanging in the balance. But to be honest, she had been thinking about Polly's low-calorie buttermilk pie for days, wondering how on earth she would ever stick to her diet without it. It had even occurred to her that she might try making one for herself, which quickly led to a fantasy of what would happen if she had entered her pie in a certain contest and won. A blueberry in the family would do wonders to perk up the mayor's campaign. Back at Alice's house, Alice's mother was having similar thoughts. She scooped some flour out of the canister and sprinkled it on the counter. Then she scraped the contents of the mixing bowl out onto the floured spot with a rubber spatula. "Who knows," she said, "after I win my blueberry, maybe I'll open a pie shop of my own. Ha! That would show Polly. I mean, really, how hard can it be to make a pie?" Alice had watched her Aunt Polly make many pies, so she knew what pie dough was supposed to look like. It was not gray and wet like the gloopy mess her mother had just plopped down on the counter. But Alice knew better than to say anything. "Has anyone seen the rolling pin?" asked Alice's mother, rummaging around in the drawer. "I know there's one in here somewhere." There was a bag of raisin bread sitting on the table. Alice was hungry, so she took out a slice and popped it into the toaster. "Do we have any more tuna fish?" she asked, while she waited for the bread to toast. "Lardo ate a whole can of it last night. I think he likes it almost as much as fried sardines." "Look in the cupboard," Alice's mother told her, "behind the baked beans. But consider it his last meal." "Well, what do you mean?" Alice asked. "I called the pound this morning, and they're expecting us to drop him off at 10. "Mom," said Alice, choosing her words carefully since it was obvious her mother was in no mood to be crossed, "Aunt Polly gave Lardo to me. Shouldn't it be up to me to decide what happens to him?" Mr. Anderson lowered his paper and peered at his daughter over the tops of his glasses. "Don't sass your mother," he warned. "I'm not sassing," Alice explained. "I'm asking." "The last thing we need in this house is another mouth to feed," Alice's mother told her. "Polly may have found her little parting gift amusing, but I do not. Say your goodbyes to the cat and have him ready to go at 10. Now, where on earth could that rolling pin be?" The toast popped up, but Alice wasn't hungry anymore. As her mother continued to dig through the kitchen drawers, Alice went to the cupboard and, unable to find any tuna fish, settled on a can of clam chowder instead. With a heavy heart, she carried it upstairs. Aunt Polly had always been so kind to her. How could Alice let her down by allowing Lardo to end up at the pound? If only she could think of some way to change her mother's mind. In her room, Alice poured the clam chowder into the bowl and flopped down on the bed to wait. If Lardo was hungry enough, he might come out and eat his breakfast even though she was still in the room. After 15 minutes, when she hadn't heard so much as a hiss out of him, Alice leaned over the side of the bed and, taking her life in her own hands, carefully lifted the dust ruffle and peeked under. No Lardo. She quickly checked under the bureau, behind the desk, and in the closet. Still no Lardo. Alice had double-checked the door before she had gone downstairs. She was sure of that. So the cat couldn't be anywhere else in the house. And that's when she noticed that the window was open. "Well, that's strange," she said to herself. Alice was certain she had closed the window before she had gone to bed. Her bedroom was on the second floor, and just outside the window was a beautiful old elm tree whose branches grew so close to the house that on windy nights they sometimes rapped against the window panes like ghostly knuckles. Alice hurried across the room to close the window, but her heart sank when she saw the unmistakable mark of a cat's paw print on the sill. She was too late. Lardo had escaped. Okay, there's chapter 4. Enjoy the rest of the book, everyone.